Good morning and welcome to the 18th meeting in 2020 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Firstly, can I give apologies on behalf of Jackie Bailey and Alec Rowley. The only item on our agenda today is to take evidence on the UK withdrawal from the European Union Continuity Scotland Bill at stage 1 from two separate panels of witnesses. And I warmly welcome our first panel of witnesses to the meeting. First of all, Jonathan Hall, who's the Director of Policy and Member Services with the NFU in Scotland, and Lloyd Austin, who's the convener of Scottish Environment Link's governance group. Morning to you both. If I may start with questions, both SE Link and NFUS have emphasised that common frameworks are essential in delivering a regulatory alignment across the UK, whilst also recognising there may also be policy areas where policy divergence is appropriate. Can I explore with you how you think the keeping pace power will interact with the common frameworks to deliver this objective? Firstly, can you tell us what your expectations are regarding the substantive content of common frameworks? For example, whether they should include minimum standards. And could I go to Lloyd Austin on that question first, please?
Thank you, Convener. Indeed, in relation to your last question, we're very keen to see minimum environmental standards. The primary concern of Environment Link members is, of course, protection, conservation, enhancement of our environment for the benefit of the environment itself, but equally for the people of Scotland. So everything we've done in approaching the policy developments in relation to leaving the EU has been related to seeking to enable governments in all parts of the UK to maintain and hopefully improve environmental standards. And with so much of environmental legislation having derived from Europe and that legislation essentially providing a degree of commonality across the UK, we do understand why there is a need for common frameworks. And we have been engaging with the Scottish Government and the UK Government over those. And there are a number in the environmental sphere. We're slightly disappointed that sort of engagement with external stakeholders has been considerably delayed and is not now expected until sometime this autumn, even though they're to be completed by the end of the year. Obviously, understandable delays this year, but nevertheless, it still seems rather last minute. I think in terms of the keeping pace power, if that's approved in this bill, then that simply is a difference of policy approach that the common frameworks needs to recognise. So the thing we've always argued is that common frameworks need to be voluntarily agreed and consistent with the policy approaches that different governments within these islands take.
Thank you. Lloyd, can I ask Jonathan Hall the same question?
Good morning, Convener. Good morning, Committee. Yes, I would tend to echo a number of the points that Lloyd has just made, in the sense that NFU Scotland, along with the other farming unions across the United Kingdom, have always maintained that in order to safeguard and enhance environmental issues and concerns, then we need to put in place commonly agreed frameworks, and I stress the word agreed because I think that then takes us into the governance of how common frameworks might operate. But it's not only about environmental protection and enhancement. Clearly, there is a need, given that environmental regulation fundamentally impacts on the ways and means in which agricultural production is undertaken. If we don't have those common frameworks across the United Kingdom, there is the distinct possibility that we will start to see the integrity of the UK internal market being affected if we have a divergence, a significant divergence of approach and regulation across the United Kingdom. And that is of significant concern to us in a number of aspects, whether you're looking at plant protection products or you're looking at application of water quality measures or air quality measures or whatever it might be, let alone before you get into biodiversity and other aspects that we're interested in. I think one of the biggest challenges that we all face, and that's not just environmental concerns or agricultural interests or indeed the political sphere, is that we're faced with something of a perpetual triangle here, in the sense that we have the EU and the EU and the EU law that is being transferred to the UK. And then we have the UK government and its environmental bill and other pieces of legislation suggesting that at some point it wants to depart from that EU legislation in some way. And then now we've got the Scottish government's proposals under the likes of the Continuity Bill, which we're considering today, which is saying that it would like to essentially keep pace with the EU regulations. And, you know, rather than confusing too many aspects of geometry here, I'm still struggling, and I think we still struggle to square that triangle in the sense that we have an EU dynamic, we have a UK dynamic, and we have a Scottish dynamic. And at the same time, we obviously want to ensure that we respect the devolution settlement, and that where flexibility and differentiation is appropriate, that is allowed to continue. So I think they are the key fundamentals that we're wrestling with here.
Thank you, Jonathan. Can I further ask you another question, Jonathan? The NFUS have expressed concern that in the absence of common frameworks, the mutual recognition proposals within the UK government's internal market paper could in fact have potential adverse effects on the competitiveness of Scottish agricultural producers. And yesterday, the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution and Europe and External Affairs told the Environment Committee that if the UK proceeds with the proposals in the White Paper, that common frameworks would, in his words, be dead. These are obviously still proposals, and we've yet to see any internal market bill. But if the UK government does proceed with the mutual recognition proposals in the White Paper without common frameworks being agreed, can I ask Jonathan Hall, what will be the potential impact of such a scenario for Scottish farmers?
Well, Convener, the impacts are potentially extremely significant. Let me start by saying that the internal UK market is vitally important to the interest of not only Scottish agriculture, but I would argue the Scottish economy as a whole. And therefore, we would always argue that we want a regulatory framework that operates to basic standards across the UK, so that there is no competitive advantage or disadvantage within the UK's single market in that respect. However, what came forward from the UK government in July, and they consulted upon over a very short 4 weeks around mutual recognition and non-discrimination, would effectively, can I use the expression, maybe drive a coach of horses through the concept of commonly agreed frameworks. Because in essence, those two principles that are being proposed in the white paper would mean that something that could be produced to a significantly different environmental standard, in one part of the UK would have to be accepted as a legitimate product to be sold or indeed used in another part of the United Kingdom. And we have many and varied examples, not only relating to the environment, but also food safety, food labelling, and all sorts of other things. I'll give you a very glib example. Imagine a cereal grower in Northumberland growing grain who would be allowed to use the product glyphosate in order to desiccate his crop, in order to harvest it in a more timely fashion. And on the other side of the Tweed in Berwickshire, that not being available. If that was the departure in regulation in that respect, that would then cause a significant disadvantage to producers in Berwickshire, but yet that same product from Northumberland would have to be accepted for use in a Scottish market and context. So that's why we say, rather than the proposals put down by the UK government, we must return to the concept of commonly agreed frameworks, whereby all the devolved administrations have a significant input into the development of those, but equally no one single devolved administration has the veto over the rest. In some ways, I guess we're trying to replicate and build structures around what already exists in the EU, in terms of the fact that you've got a Commission, a Council of Ministers, and ultimately you've got a European Parliament as well. With the UK's withdrawal from the EU, we are losing that governance, if you like, and I think that's a major concern.
Thank you, Jonathan. I know that other colleagues want to come back to these particular matters later in the evidence-taking session, but finally, can I ask, are there any amendments to the continuity bill that either the NFUS or SE Link would support in seeking to address the potential implications of the internal market proposals? And perhaps I could ask Lloyd to pick up that first, and I'll come back to you, Jonathan, before we then move on to Murdo.
Yes, thank you, convener. First of all, I'd agree with much of what Jonathan has just said in relation to the internal market. We, as Link, responded to the UK government's white paper and can send the committee our response if that would be of interest. We had no difficulty in principle with the concept of an internal market which has economic benefits, or with even the principles of non-discrimination and mutual recognition. However, we were very concerned that the paper was confusing and contradictory in relation to the application of those principles in relation to environmental regulation, in relation to devolution, and a number of other matters. And we would, we haven't obviously seen the detail of any bill, but the white paper was both confusing and worrying in terms of its emphasis on deregulation and its emphasis on uniformity of approach. I wouldn't go necessarily as far as Michael Russell in saying that common frameworks would be dead, but we particularly stressed that we felt that the work on a common framework should be completed and their impact and application done before any procedure with any internal market legislation, that the jointly agreed approach of common frameworks was preferable, and we didn't think the case had been made for internal market regulation. In terms of the continuity bill, I mean, my feeling is that the keeping pace power is very welcome, and no doubt we'll come on to discuss how that could be improved. The extent to which it interacts with the internal market white paper really just does depend on the detail of whatever internal market legislation comes forward, which no one has seen yet. So I'm afraid the answer to your first question is we don't know yet.
Okay, understandably. Jonathan, would you like to add anything at this stage before I go to Murdo?
No, thank you, convener. I'm sure we'll come back to things.
Okay.
Sorry.
Murdo Fraser, thanks.
Did you hear that?
Thanks, convener. I'd like to focus my questions on the issue of parliamentary scrutiny. I wonder if I could start by putting a question to Johnny Hall from NFUS. I noticed in the NFUS submission that there is some comments around the level of parliamentary scrutiny. The evidence we've taken from other groups, including the Law Society and the Faculty of Advocates last week, do express concerns that this bill puts Scottish producers in the position of being rule takers but not rule makers, because potentially laws made elsewhere that we've had no input into will be introduced to Scotland, but without going through the process of primary legislation with all the consultation and scrutiny that would involve. So I wonder if I could get Johnny Hall's take on that particular aspect, and whether bringing in substantial policy changes by means of secondary legislation is an appropriate way to take this forward.
Thank you. Yes, I would tend to agree with your comments, or at least what you've reflected from others that you've heard from. I think there is a danger that if we absolutely align ourselves with what happens in terms of environmental regulation at a European level and bind ourselves to that, then we have less flexibility going forward to make things more appropriate in a Scottish context, which then ties our hands in terms of what policy objectives we might want to achieve. And I think, I take some comfort from the fact that the existing EU regulation around things like Nitrates Directive, Water Framework Directive, and even the Common Agricultural Policy has a degree of flexibility in it, which allows member states or regions such as Scotland to apply things through secondary legislation, as long as it adheres to the principles of the directives, etc., and the basic fundamental rules. So I think there is an absolute requirement that Scotland, through the Scottish Parliament, retains an ability to adapt things for Scottish circumstances. We all know that Scotland is unique in many, many respects in terms of both its environment and its agricultural profile. And I think if we're going to keep pace with and remain aligned to EU regulation, then we need an ability to adapt that to Scottish circumstances rather than it being fixed.
Okay, thanks very much. So, I mean, just to be clear, when you say adapt, if we were introducing new laws by means of secondary legislation, there is no scope for the Parliament to amend these. So you mean that should be done by primary legislation?
Yes, whatever the most appropriate route is, in a sense, and again, I think I'm picking out a reasonable example. If you look at something like the Water Framework Directive, which basically was transposed into Scots law in the early 2000s through the Water Services and Water Environment and Water Services Act, and then various bits of secondary legislation. But that enabled Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament and stakeholders to have a significant input as to how that would work in practice on the ground in terms of Scotland meeting its obligations under the Water Framework Directive, etc. And I think you can apply that to the Birds Directive, the Habitats Directive, and various other things. So having that ability, I think, is absolutely paramount.
Okay, thanks very much. And just my final question on this. In relation to previous witness panels, we've tried to draw a distinction between what might be minor and technical changes to existing EU laws that might be dealt with appropriately by secondary legislation. So, tweaks to existing legislation, changes to dates, changes to lists of products, for example, as opposed to entirely new policy areas. So, you mentioned environment policy. If there was a new EU directive bringing in environmental policies to Scotland, that's not something we would have had any input into the formation of. There'd be no consultation around that. So do you think there is a distinction to be drawn between minor technical changes that might be dealt with by regulation as opposed to major policy changes?
Yes, I do. And the reason why I say that is, having just gone through the process of the Agriculture EU Retained Law and Data Scotland Bill, which has just passed through stage 3 of the Scottish Parliament, there are elements of that which are clearly technical in nature, which can be essentially tweaked by Scottish Government through secondary legislation and regulation. As you say, in order to bring about minor changes. But equally, if there was a significant departure as to how we were to support agriculture in the future and what the objectives and the purpose of that would be, then I think that requires much more open scrutiny and open consultation. So a significant amount of debate around that bill that's gone through the Parliament was around the issues of how much consultation and indeed whether it's an affirmative or a negative procedure around different aspects of that bill. And I think that's one area that might set a precedent as to how we handle environmental changes going forward as well.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Murdo. Before we go into Dean, just for the record, I think we should probably hear from Lloyd Austin from SE Link on that recent exchange and what the views of SE Link might be.
Thank you, Convener. Scrutiny, in our view, is a good thing because we're, as NGOs and as stakeholders, we're interested in improving the engagement and consultation between policymakers and decision takers and those interested parties. I think we're probably relatively neutral on what parliamentary techniques, procedures are used for what types of regulation, but we would generally favour more engagement and more consultation where possible, so that all relevant stakeholders are included. And, you know, in that regard, whether or not the different instruments are subject to different procedures might be one of the things that the government and perhaps a sifting committee, which has been discussed at Westminster, I know, might be one way of dealing with that, so that rather than try and define the difference between minor and technical and significant in advance, that those each decided on its merits as the different proposals come forward. But I think I would agree with Johnny about the need to link the use of these powers to a purpose. I mean, we very much welcome the Scottish Government's commitment to maintain and exceed EU environmental standards. And whilst EU environmental standards are good, that is a very good ambition to have. Of course, one can't see in the future, and so I'm slightly concerned that we don't define our environmental ambition by environmental standards rather than by the standards of someone else, if you see what I mean. So I think there's a great potential in developing the environmental strategy that the Scottish Government has developed to give that some statutory underpinning and link the purpose of keeping pace to the better delivery of that environmental strategy.
Yeah, well, there's a slight contradiction, I think, Lloyd, what you've said compared with the evidence that I'm reading from Link here. And I recognise you've said, obviously, that Parliament has the time and resources to adequately scrutinise secondary legislation. That's quite clear in your submission. But it also says Link members are content with the proposals to maintain alignment through secondary rather than primary legislation. That recognising allowing already limited parliamentary time to be saved for keeping pace powers to be used effectively to match developments at the EU level. So that's why I was asking you to come in terms of making sure that the Link position was clear for the record. And I just want to, is that position of Link or is it not?
Yes.
Okay.
We are content in as much as I don't think it's necessarily for us to decide what parliamentary procedure is used for what, but we would like to see as much consultation and engagement either before the parliamentary process begins or during the parliamentary process.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. Dean Lockhart, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'd like to follow up on the previous discussion with the NFUS in relation to the keeping pace with the European directives or regulations. If we do keep pace with EU regulations without obviously having the ability to influence or change those regulations at an EU level, would there be concerns that those regulations might very well be more suitable for the EU market and EU farmers rather than being adapted and more appropriate for the Scottish agricultural sector?
I think there is that risk. You know, like any regulation or environmental conditionality that might be applied to Scottish agricultural production. Yes, there is an absolute need for that, but equally it has to reflect circumstances as well. And that's why I've already referred to the fact that we need a degree of flexibility. That whilst I think that keeping pace can probably apply to the principles established by the EU in terms of environmental regulation, but their applicability in Scotland, I think, has to be adaptable to Scottish circumstances. And as I say, I think we've already seen aspects of that in practice under various directives. And equally, we've seen it under the auspices of the Common Agricultural Policy in terms of some of the cross-compliance conditions, etc., which have been, can I say, tweaked to better suit Scottish circumstances. However, having said that, the ability to tweak is always and has been somewhat constrained, and that has proved a frustration, not only for Scottish agriculture itself, but I would think arguably for some of the administrators of schemes and indeed the enforcers of some of the EU regulation, that it isn't necessarily always in the best interest of Scotland in terms of achieving the objectives that we want to pursue if we are essentially asked to adhere to regulation that is applicable across effectively 27 member states. Does Scotland have that ability to tailor things that meets its needs? So there are definitely risks. That's why I think we still need to have that ability to adjust appropriately, that rather than have absolute harmonization of regulation. I think it's about reflecting and adhering to the basic principles of those regulations, but enabling ourselves to then adapt those for Scottish circumstances.
Thanks very much, Johnny, for that. I'd like to turn now to the submission you provided the committee. In the submission, you say that keeping pace with the EU has clear potential to lead to substantial regulatory divergence and therefore economic divergence with the rest of the UK, and that's something you identify as a major concern. I wonder, just to give us some practical examples or specific scenarios, if you could give us those examples where regulatory divergence with the rest of the UK might give rise to problems in the agricultural sector?
Yeah, well, I think I've already alluded to some of those instances, and they are, as I say, potentially numerous. If Scotland essentially remains aligned to the EU and the EU takes one particular approach, let's say in the organic standard setting, or indeed the use of gene editing and other technologies, but the rest of the UK does not, where does that leave Scottish agriculture vis-à-vis its competitive position in the internal UK market? And these are definitely some of the comments that or questions we've raised in our submission to the Committee on the Continuity Bill. And they're also exactly the same questions that we're raising with the UK government vis-à-vis their white paper proposals on the UK internal market. At the end of the day, the UK internal market is far more important to the interests of Scottish agriculture than the EU market or other export markets. 60% of what leaves Scotland doesn't go much further than England in terms of our agricultural and food products. And therefore, ensuring that we are not in any way disadvantaged because of a regulatory alignment no longer applying in the UK market, then I think that's something that we need to be very, very mindful of indeed. And I think the other dimension that we haven't added to this is that we still have to see what the future relationship between the UK and the EU will be on these matters. If that is significantly diverging from where we are now today, and the UK essentially starts to veer away from the EU in that respect, but Scotland, through the Continuity Bill, essentially retains alignment with, then I think that will start to put extreme stresses on the operation of the internal UK market. And that's clearly something we want to avoid. That's why we've been very critical of the UK government's proposals, and that's why we still have concerns about the aspects of the continuity bill, and that's why we still believe that commonly agreed frameworks, as we've set out, are the right approach.
Thanks very much. And Johnny, just a final question on common frameworks. Once, and the interaction between common frameworks and the internal market proposals, once the common frameworks are agreed, typically the expectation is that those common frameworks would sit outside the internal market proposals, and the internal market proposals would not necessarily override the common frameworks.
Well, anything that would essentially render the common frameworks redundant because they could be ridden roughshod over, I think is something we need to avoid. The purpose of the common frameworks is absolutely clear to everybody. I think where we are still very much in the dark is how they would operate and be governed in practice, so that they are effective. I go back to the parallel with where we are with the EU at the moment. We do have this huge institution called the European Commission, and like it or loathe it, it does perform a function. And I'm not suggesting that we have another European Commission sitting in the UK, but we do need that third party out with the sort of the respective UK government and the devolved administrations, which enable the governance of common frameworks to be overseen properly and effectively.
Thank you. Thanks, Dean. I know we're going to get deeper into this because John Mason wants to, I think, also cover some of these issues, but there's also a reality. If the internal market bill becomes legislation, it is legislation, and common frameworks at this stage are not on a legislative basis. So whatever happens, the legislative process would trump all. But I'm sure John might get into that area himself in terms of the other questions that he might want to ask. John.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, asking my questions kind of for me. Can I just pick up on what was just said just now, that Mr. Hall, that if there was divergence with England or the rest of the UK, that would put strain on the internal market. I mean, could you expand on that a little bit? Because I mean, at the moment, as I understand it, a lot of Scottish products get a premium price, like beef and salmon and a range of things, butter, I think. So if we've got higher standards, does it not just mean we get a higher price when we sell them in England?
You're absolutely right to suggest that Scottish products do generally command a premium, but that premium is not huge. It's something we need to work hard to protect and maintain, and that's why having environmental standards that underpin that premium and the way we produce food in Scotland, et cetera, and the provenance is so important to us. However, we don't make a margin just on the price of what we sell our products for. A lot of it relates to the costs of production. And when we're looking at regulation and environmental standards, they have an influence on the costs of production rather than the price at which you sell the product. And the situation could clearly come about by if we had a significant divergence in regulation across the United Kingdom, that producers in Scotland would face higher costs of production because of adherence to a certain set of standards which weren't having to be met by other producers in the rest of the United Kingdom. And therefore, that would diminish the margin that we have in terms of the products we sell in the UK market. That could put us at a serious disadvantage. I illustrated earlier on with a very glib example around the use of a product called glyphosate. If glyphosate was to be banned for use in Scotland but was available for use in the rest of the United Kingdom, that would put a severe strain on the productivity and profitability of cereal production in Scotland. And you can apply that to all sorts of other things in terms of other regulations. As I say, the very sensitive area around gene editing and things like that, if those tools were available to producers in other parts of the United Kingdom, that would afford them an advantage that would lower their costs of production that wouldn't perhaps be available to Scottish producers. So yes, you're right.
You're not arguing that we all go down to the kind of lowest common level, are you?
Absolutely not. As I said in my comments a few moments ago, actually, it's in Scotland's interest to maintain the highest of standards, because that's one element of what our premium is built. But we could have a premium product selling at a premium price, but if it costs us because of regulatory standards a much higher to produce a kilo of beef in Scotland as it would be in other parts of the United Kingdom, that would disadvantage Scottish producers. So it's absolutely not about a race to the bottom. It's about maintaining high standards and enabling that and ensuring that those aren't undercut. And by undercutting standards, you cut costs in many situations. And we want to avoid that. We want to play the same rule book.
Yes, that's great. Thanks. Now, going back to the structures thing, I mean, in your evidence, it says that the NFUS remains concerned that departure from the EU has created a legislative void which the UK government seeks to fill without introducing equivalent structures. And you kind of touched on that when you were answering Bruce Crawford in his questions. So what kind of structures do you think we need? I mean, you said obviously not repeating the European Commission, but some kind of third-party body or something?
You're absolutely right. I would have used the expression third party, and yeah, I'm not after creating an institution as big as the European Commission and all the rest of it. But as I said earlier, like it or loathe it, the Commission does perform a function, and by and large, it carries out that duty well. That we're all accountable in some ways, whether we're administrators or farmers or just member states, that we adhere to the word and the will of the Commission in carrying out our responsibilities. And I think what we need in the UK under commonly agreed frameworks is some sort of third party structure. I have no absolute clear vision as to what that might look like, but I know that others have thought about this in terms of the academic world, have thought about how this might be involved. To evolve and develop, and I guess it comes around to almost service level agreements and memorandums of understanding between the devolved administrations, and then some sort of, as I say, third party body to oversee these things. In some ways, we already have that in things like the Food Standards Agency in the rest of the UK and Food Standards Scotland, etc. But obviously they don't apply across the whole of the UK. But they are at arm's length from government. I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, because if we don't have these, what is the risk if we don't have Dutch bodies in place?
Well, I think, well, I'm no constitutional expert at all, but I think there's then the risk if we don't have that a UK government arguing that it has to adhere to international obligations and equally it is negotiating trade deals on behalf of the UK, would have an excessive influence over the devolved administrations, potentially even in already existing devolved areas. And I think that's what we've got to safeguard against. Because again, whilst we want to adhere to basic principles around regulation, we also want a degree of flexibility as to how we do things across the United Kingdom.
Okay, thanks very much. And if I could just ask one question, I think, to Mr. Austin. I mean, if you want to comment on any of this, you're welcome. But my specific point for you was, in your evidence, you say that you would prefer the bill to be amended to require Scottish ministers to keep pace with environmental outcomes rather than enabling them. And I just wondered if you could expand on why you think that's the case and if it's possible.
Yes, thank you. I'll come to that specific question in a moment, but just briefly wanted to comment on the previous exchange, yes, which kind of looked at the question of whether or not regulatory approaches how uniform they should be versus how much flexibility there should be between jurisdictions or between local areas. And I think it's a long-running debate, and you can always argue for more uniformity and you can always argue for more flexibility. And that's one of the reasons why I think that in terms of environmental outcomes, it's important to define what you're trying to achieve which comes back to my argument for an overall strategy, which the Scottish Government has in a non-statutory sense, but we would like to see that put in a more, given a statutory underpinning, and many of the environmental duties that the government has being linked to the achievement of the outcomes of those strategies. Another way in which you can deal with the uniformity flexibility dilemma is through common frameworks. And I think I would underline everything that both Johnny and I said earlier about the benefit of common frameworks. And in an environmental and a regulatory sense, I would like to see those common frameworks include clear minimum standards that each administration seeks to achieve, but giving them the flexibility to be able to go further if they wish. So again, using a phrase that came before, I would prefer to see a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom. And that's one issue that we took raised concern with the UK paper on the internal market, in as much as it appeared to underline a sort of deregulatory race to the bottom approach. But I would, and finally, in terms of structures, we've commented that the intergovernmental processes have been quite dysfunctional for a number of, for a while, and you know, we have seen academic work on that. We've even commissioned some academic work on that from things like the Institute for Government. But we note that there is an intergovernmental relations review underway. It's the UK government and the devolved administrations are all involved, but it appears to have stalled. And we, you know, it was referred to in the UK white paper on the internal market, but what proposals it is likely to come up with, no one knows. So those kind of structural issues are important to resolve. I must come on to your specific question now, related to the keeping pace power versus keeping pace duty. Yes, we would very much like to see the power firmed up. We do recognise the difficulty of making it a simplistic duty, because there will be circumstances through no fault of, or due to international circumstances, due to changes in the EU, due to changes in the UK, due to unknown events because of the EU-UK negotiations, etc., where keeping pace may not be possible, or a means of keeping pace in a more sophisticated manner is required. And so therefore we think it should be linked to that kind of purpose question that I was talking about, so that the power is preceded with the purpose of having this power is to achieve our environmental ambitions. And we should make it a duty to use the power where it's necessary to try and achieve those environmental ambitions. And you could broaden that purpose to other public interest concerns. So I know you're speaking to Human Rights Consortium later. So the purpose could include environmental standards and environmental ambitions, but it could also include social protections and employment protections and other things like that, so that it becomes a duty, but not a blanket simplistic duty that in all circumstances it must happen, but that Scottish ministers must exercise this power in a way, in whatever way is possible, to achieve the purposes stated, such as environmental standards.
Okay,
and then,
that's great.
Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, John. I'm now going to go to Tom Arthur, but just before I do that, I'll be very interested to see what that amendment looks like at some stage. That sounds pretty complicated in terms of that last answer. But Tom.
And good morning. My first question is to Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, you've alluded to the relationship between regulatory standards and the cost of production, with the implications for profitability and inter-UK competitiveness. I wonder if you could explain to me, as a layperson, what the relationship is between regulatory standards and quality of product.
Well, I think, as I alluded to, and in response to the previous question, certainly environmental standards and I must also add in animal health and welfare standards absolutely underpin the quality of a product, and no more so the case in Scottish agriculture. That premium price that I talked about earlier is essentially safeguarded by the fact that we are adhering to some of the highest environmental and animal health and welfare standards that we know. Obviously, significantly in that is that is a product of EU regulation and legislation. But equally, any erosion of that, and we've referred to, we don't want to race to the bottom. Any erosion of that risks undermining that quality and that the provenance of Scottish agricultural product. So it's important that we retain the ability to have the highest of standards, not only for the standards themselves, i.e. the safeguarding environmental interests, etc., but equally in order to then promote and market the product of Scotland.
Thank you. I recognise that NUF's position is for there to be mutually agreed common frameworks. But if I could just ask you to indulge me for a moment and speculate in a scenario where there were to be regulatory divergence. Say, for example, Scotland was to maintain and expand upon existing standards, but perhaps within England they chose to relax standards somewhat, to perhaps prioritise quantity over quality, for example. What would be the implications for the agriculture sector within Scotland as a consequence of that? Where do you think the balance is between the quantity, the quality, the premium of Scottish produce and competing against a more profitable English sector in that hypothetical scenario?
You identify a clear risk. At the end of the day, neither the UK nor Scotland within the UK is significantly big enough to really cut it on a stack it high, sell it low basis in any market, whether it's the domestic UK market or indeed an international market in any commodity, whether you're talking beef, lamb, cereals, or dairy products or whatever it might be. We are just not a big player, and therefore quantity is not a game we want to play. Quality is where we need to focus, and that's why it is absolutely essential that across the United Kingdom we retain the highest of standards, because especially if we're in a trade agreement with another country, that we're selling a UK product, not necessarily a Scottish product, although we'd obviously want to market Scottish products as such, then we'd do so on a standards basis or on a quality basis rather than a quantity basis. Therefore, it goes back to that argument the discussion we're having about how do you ensure that those standards are upheld, and that comes back to the commonly agreed frameworks issue and how they are governed. Because at the end of the day, the last thing a commonly agreed framework would be is if it was top-down imposed centrally, and the devolved administrations, for example, just had to run with it. Equally, no devolved administration or any one administration should be able to veto the others. So that is where you come into the whole aspect of how commonly agreed frameworks could and should work, so that they are, as it says on the tin, commonly agreed, not just common frameworks, but commonly agreed, with the input of all administrations. So that, yes, you could have a degree of divergence, but you operate within a standard that is upheld, and that, in some senses, is where we need to get to.
Okay, you had mentioned implications potentially of trade deals with other countries. There has been much, commentary on the potential for a trade deal with the United States and implications for food standards, animal welfare standards across the UK as a consequence. Clearly that would have implications upon common frameworks. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but I suppose the question I have to ask is as much as I appreciate and I agree and I'm very sympathetic the position you've articulated as the need for mutually agreed common frameworks. That's the position that the Scottish Government and other devolved administrations. Ultimately, we have a system of constitutional arrangements within the UK where Westminster is the sovereign parliament. Where does the buck stop? Because sometimes there can be attempts at agreement, but ultimately agreement can't be reached. Who should be the ultimate arbiter? Who should ultimately get to make the decision upon these matters about what should be a common framework, even if it's not commonly shared in terms of?
Well, I think the ultimate arbiter, in many senses, need to be taken out of the gift of different governments. That's why I suggest a third party should be the arbiter in these instances. I go back to the fact that the Commission operates in a way that oversees the development and delivery of regulation across the EU at the moment. I would suggest that we need a third party to do likewise within the UK, whereby each of the devolved administrations is like a member state or the Council of Ministers, and then they agree to what's been proposed and accept then the governance around that once it's in place in law. So I certainly don't think that the UK government should have the ultimate ability to impose on the rest of the UK. Otherwise, that would, I think, obviously, constitutionally, in terms of respecting the devolution settlement, would clearly have an impact on that. But I think that would not be in Scotland's interest in terms of retaining the standards to which we currently operate and the markets in which we want to work.
So, if I could maybe just summarise to make sure I've understood what your position is, would it be that ultimately we should be agreed through a negotiation that should never actually have to come to any sort of backstop measures, but ultimately it should be a relationship of equality and parity, with no one administration able to cast a veto, but equally no one administration able to impose over another?
Absolutely. We've always said it should not be imposed. Everything we said about commonly agreed frameworks is couched in the fact that no one administration should impose on the others, and equally no one administration should be able to veto in that sense either. That will then coerce the point at which you get to common agreement, because ultimately no one party has a final say over the others.
Thank you very much. If I may, Convener, I have one question for Mr. Austin.
Okay. Thank
you. Mr. Austin, in page 5 of the linked submission, in the second paragraph, just at the near the bottom of it, it refers to a desire for the race to the top for strong environmental standards. You want to say the thrust of the white papers, this is a UK internal market white paper, suggests that there is a considerable risk of a race to the bottom for standards across the UK, with no legislative underpinning to maintain high environmental standards posed. Without agreement of the common minimum standards across all 4 nations and a clear framework outlining the interaction of these standards with trade agreements, there is a risk Ministers' ability to keep pace with EU environmental standards are jeopardised by pressure to remain competitive. I just wonder if you could perhaps expand on that and say what the implication of the UK government's internal market white papers, what the implications are for the operability of the continuity bill should it be passed.
I think this comes back to one of my comments very early on in answer to the convener's questions, that in our view the white paper was confusing and unclear in terms of how the market principles would be applied and how they would be balanced or qualified with environmental principles, with principles of proportionality, and with ensuring that they are consistent with the devolution settlement and how they interacted with whatever is agreed in relation to common frameworks. In terms of, because of that, we did feel that if the white paper was implemented in a simplistic way in which the white paper was drafted, it would lead to a risk of a deregulatory race to the bottom, and the inability, therefore, for Scottish Government to use the powers that they're talking about in this continuity bill to achieve their environmental ambitions, because the kind of pressure from to enable the economy to compete with a much more unregulated economy elsewhere in the UK would effectively override its ambitions to maintain high environmental standards here. Now, I would qualify that by saying that that is if the white paper was introduced simplistically, because we don't know what the detail of any legislative proposal is. So the ultimate answer is it's unclear. It's unclear what the white details of any legislation are. It's unclear what the EU-UK relationships are. It's unclear what the UK government is going to, how they're going to proceed with a common framework. So there's an awful lot of lack of clarity around in terms of being able to make any definitive judgment. But I would very much agree with Johnny there about the risks and the need to balance this question of uniformity and flexibility. I mean, the uniformity of regulation can be a positive, but equally regulation has differed between the nations of the UK for years. I'm old enough to have worked with the Scottish office before devolution, and regulations were different in those days. There's nothing inherently bad about different regulations in different jurisdictions. That is the application of the flexibility principle and the local appropriateness. So how these things are all balanced and interact is still yet to be clarified, really.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruston.
Thanks, Tom. I didn't realise you were that old, Lloyd. I'm a former Scottish Office civil servant from all these years ago. You look a hell of a better nick than I do. But that said, Patrick Harvey, he doesn't look in bad nick himself.
Thank you, convener. You're doing marvellously, don't worry. Good morning to the witnesses as well. One of the wearily familiar themes of the whole Brexit saga is you can't always get what you want. A campaign that promised people all of the possible upsides and benefits, acknowledged none of the downsides, has given way to many, many situations where difficult choices have to be made. And in this instance, we could choose to place all of our emphasis on protecting the jurisdiction's right to make its own choices and never to be a rule taker. We could prioritise high standards. We could prioritise keeping the integrity of an internal market with no potential barriers or divergence within the UK. But we can't do all of them at once. EU membership gave us not just the integrity of the UK, but the EU single market. It gave us protection for high standards. The cost was that EU countries have to accept sometimes some regulations that they wouldn't have chosen to make if they were on their own. Given that Brexit now places all of this emphasis on UK regulatory sovereignty, do the witnesses accept, and Jonathan Hall first of all, that there is inevitably going to be, whether in the short, medium or long term, a conflict between protecting high standards and protecting the integrity of the UK internal market? And if there is that conflict through trade deals with other non-UK, non-EU countries, to Jonathan Hall, first of all, which is more important to your members? The ability of the UK to prevent divergence within the UK internal market, the ability of Scotland to protect high standards, those two things are in conflict.
Well, I certainly appreciate the complexity and difficulties. I agree with an awful lot of the sentiment that Mr. Harvey's just expressed around difficult choices. And whilst we've operated in an EU single market for almost 50 years, I guess, and often we've cursed and criticised the regulations and everything that's come with that. Equally, in accepting those regulations and rules and governance, it's also given us access to the single market. It's given us access to lots of other things, not least in terms of common agricultural policy spending. So I've always taken the view that actually accepting those regulations and that uniformity, to use Lloyd's expression, in many, many ways, although we do have a degree of flexibility, has been a price worth paying, rather than being in isolation, but be as part of that single market. Where we are right now, and this is the real challenge, and I alluded to it earlier on, is this: we are now in the prospect of a triangular relationship between the UK's relationship with the EU, Scotland's relationship with the rest of the UK, and Scotland's relationship with the EU, and how we square that's going to be incredibly important to the interests of Scotland overall, not least Scottish agriculture. But I think, to answer your question directly, I have to be very, very clear that the UK internal market is more important to Scottish agriculture and Scottish food production than the EU market, or indeed any potential export market as things stand. There's a market of 50 million plus people on our doorstep. That is just a statement of fact.
Sorry for interrupting, but can I just maybe emphasise the thing that I think is missing here? You've got that three-way relationship, but the relationship with the wider world outside of the UK and the EU is not just about exports. It's also about the threat to you and your members of the importation of products that undercut standards that apply here. And if we get a conflict between the desire for high standards and the desire for a uniform, integrated UK internal market, that is a real threat to you and to your members, as well as to the global reputation of Scottish agriculture, if we see your members being undercut and Scotland unable to protect them against the importation of goods that undercut you.
I entirely agree, and that's why we've been at pains to stress to the UK government about any trade negotiation, not least the future relationship with the EU. The future relationship with the EU needs to be as close to friction-free as absolutely possible, so we continue to be able to trade with the EU as effectively as we currently do now, although we won't be part of the single market or the customs union. And that any future trading arrangements with non-EU countries, we've absolutely maintained time and time again that safeguards must be put in place, that the importation of products from the US or from Australia, New Zealand, from anywhere, have to adhere to the same high standards to which we currently operate today. I've already fallen out big style with some individuals in recent days about that argument. That argument is very, very clear in our mind, that we need to put those safeguards in place. So I totally accept the dilemma that the Scottish agriculture and the food industry faces. We at the one hand, we do not want to be undercut by substandard product. Absolutely not. We want to retain the integrity of our product and the standards to which we currently operate. We want to be able to sell that on an even footing with farmers across the United Kingdom. But equally, we want access to the European market as we do now. Now, as you said earlier on, we're almost wanting everything. But I guess that's the situation we find ourselves in.
And can I put the same issues to Lloyd Austin? I imagine that Scottish Environment Link will place the emphasis on protecting high standards being more important than totally frictionless, integrated UK internal market, particularly given the last comment about the fact that there have always been areas of regulatory divergence within the UK. But if, for example, the issue that was mentioned earlier around glyphosate, if that comes up for a decision at EU level in another couple of years' time, whether to end the use of glyphosate, and the EU, because I think Germany has changed its position now, if the EU was to go for a ban and the UK didn't, should Scotland, and would Scotland under these proposals be in a position to make a decision for itself about whether Scottish agriculture will match that EU standard or continue with a tracking pace with the UK decision on those issues? This is a matter of agriculture and environment. Under the original Scotland Act, you would say it's a fully devolved matter. And outside of the EU, under these proposals, will we be in a strong enough position to make that choice for ourselves?
Thank you. First of all, you're right insofar as Scottish Environment Link will always put environmental standards and environmental ambition as our primary objective. We completely understand, and the other parties, other interests, and it's the role of have other primary objectives, and it's the role of government and parliaments to balance all of those issues. I think that's one of the reasons why I keep stressing the environmental ambitions and the need to give a strategy and our environmental targets on some degree of statutory underpinning, so that we know the purpose that we're trying to use these powers for. In relation to trade and standards, whether that trade is within the UK or elsewhere, I do agree with what Johnny was saying earlier. Indeed, environmental NGOs and the NFUS and the other farming unions across the UK have joined together in a campaign to try and ensure that environmental standards, animal welfare standards and so forth are maintained in any trade deals that the UK government does with other countries. We've so far been unsuccessful in getting any legislative commitment to that, but we continue to work together to try and achieve that aim. So in that regard, the interests of agriculture and the interests of the environmental NGOs are pretty much aligned. What I would say is that I think under the proposals in this bill, the Scottish Government would be free to propose to follow the EU move, even if the UK government didn't. What might undermine that freedom would be any proposals emanating from the UK government's internal market white paper. But as I've said before, we don't know whether that's for certain or not. The suggestions and the sort of direction of travel hinted by the white paper suggested a move towards a deregulatory approach, a uniformity approach, etc. But we haven't seen the detail of the legislation. The white paper also says that they will implement the two market principles in the same way as they apply in the single market within the EU. But the two principles...
It's the deeper problem, though, that that's an expression of current UK government policy, but there would be nothing to prevent either the same government making a latest decision or a subsequent government making another decision to diverge further from high standards, whether in pursuit of a trade deal or for other free market ideological purposes.
Indeed. So the white paper does suggest a kind of ability for the UK government to seek to drive a race to the bottom, rather than put their everybody put their commitments behind a common framework defining minimum standards, which could then generate a race to the top. I think that's the worry that the white paper suggests. But what the white paper fails to explain is how market principles which apply in the EU single market which are in the current circumstances within the EU or even in the current transition period in the UK, applied in a qualified way. Within the EU, non-discrimination and mutual recognition applies, but they are qualified by the need for public interest regulation, by the need for local flexibility, devolution, or federal arrangements in different countries. So if we are going to move those market principles from the single market in the EU to the internal market in the UK, we need to bring across the qualifications as well as the principles. And the white paper did not make that clear. However, it claimed that they were going to maintain their environmental ambitions and it was consistent with devolution. So that suggests that maybe they are going to bring across the qualifications. The point is, it's completely contradictory and confusing, and no one knows the answer until we see the actual legislation.
Thank you both very much.
Thanks, Patrick. Alexander Burnett, please.
Morning. If I go to Jonathan first. Last week we heard from Michael Clancy, who said there was a very important distinction between the Continuity Bill in Westminster, which was very much an obligation to be put in place, and the one being proposed here, which is very much one of choice. So I just wonder, given all the concerns we've heard this morning of economic risk, all the concerns about the lack of scrutiny, and given all the alternatives that anything being proposed here could be done through primary legislation as and when required, could I ask a more simple and fundamental question of whether you think this bill is necessary at all?
It's quite a question, though, a simple question, but I'm not so sure you'll get a very simple answer. I think if we're going to respect and retain the ability to do things, as Lloyd has referred to it a few times, in terms of having flexibility within Scotland, yes, we need a bill, or at least legislation, to enable Scottish Government to, and therefore the Scottish Parliament, to act in the interests of Scotland on environmental matters in particular and the governance thereof. Whether this piece of legislation needs to go as far as keeping pace with the EU is, I guess, the moot point here. So I think, yes, legislation is required because Scotland needs to retain its flexibility in all aspects of environmental regulation as they come back to the UK, and other devolved administrations would want to probably have a similar arrangement. But whether that should then lead to essentially keeping pace with or alignment with the EU going forward is another matter.
Thank you. And to Lloyd?
Well, I know this evidence session is primarily on part one of the bill and the keeping pace, which I'll come on to. But in answer to your question, is the bill necessary? Absolutely, because part two on environmental principles and environmental governance are absolutely required. Those are areas that environmental NGOs have been campaigning for ever since the referendum as something that needs to be addressed as we leave the EU. And the UK government is proposing similar measures in the Environment Bill to apply to England and reserve matters and for Northern Ireland as well. So those aspects of the bill are absolutely necessary. They can be improved upon, as our evidence to the Environment Committee makes clear, but they are absolutely necessary. In relation to the keeping pace power, I think that is a political choice. I think the more kind of how the achievement of environmental standards is achieved, whether that's tied into EU standards or defined standards, is a matter of political choice. And Environment Link will simply argue for the highest and the best environmental ambitions possible and means to achieve those. And that's one of the reasons why I will repeat my suggestion that the keeping pace power is linked to a purpose. And from the environmental perspective, the purpose would be to achieve the environmental objectives of the environment strategy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Angela, you had a supplementary before I go to George, I think.
After George will be fine, thanks.
Okay, right, George Adam, thank you. George, she's coming after you now.
Thank you, Convener. I was just waiting for my microphone to go on here. Thank you. Good morning, gentlemen. Can I ask, particularly, I'll ask Lloyd Austin this question initially. Scottish Environment Link's written submission highlights the importance of a continued close relationship between Scotland and the EU, and we've discussed that quite a lot in detail today. But there's one bit that struck me when I was reading your submission, Lloyd, was that you've said, however, on environmental matters, a continued close relationship between Scotland and the EU is critically important for continued cooperation on cross-border and shared environmental challenges. Now, can I ask you a reasonably simple question is, what do you mean by this? Just to kind of get this right in my own head, and how would you suggest we actually achieve that?
What we mean by it is that any part of the globe should have a close relationship with its neighbouring parts of the globe, and that, you know, we as well as neighbouring the rest of the UK, we neighbour other parts of Europe, some of which like Denmark are in the EU, and some of which like Norway and Iceland are not in the EU. We should have close relationships with all of them, and there are lots of shared environmental challenges because pollution knows no boundaries, species and habitats cross boundaries. Countries I've mentioned, obviously we have shared fish stocks with, and we need to work with them to manage those in a joint way if we possibly could. So there are lots of environmental challenges which can be best addressed by different jurisdictions working together and sharing the challenges. I think from the NGO's perspective, we've no intention of not continuing liaison with our NGOs in other countries. Just in a personal capacity, I remain the UK board member of the European Environment Bureau, and the NGOs will continue to be members of that network, and I've no doubt that NFUS will continue to be a member of the network of farming unions across Europe, whether that's defined as just the EU or wider Europe. I think that doesn't necessarily matter, as long as whichever governance arrangements for different cross-border challenges recognise what those governments and international bodies, which international bodies are responsible for what. We can argue that for respective governments and international bodies to do what's necessary to address the environmental challenges. So the more networking and joint working, the better, irrespective of whatever constitutional and political arrangements are put in place.
It's quite interesting you say that, Lloyd, on the back of your continued engagement within Europe, because there's also a part in your submission in page 4 where you say you've got some concerns about post-Brexit trade deals and their impact. Now, we've discussed this slightly here, but you said actually we share the concerns of other third sector organisations that there must be a greater transparency, parliamentary scrutiny, involvement from all devolved parliaments and stakeholders in negotiations of post-Brexit trade deals. Now, do you have concerns of the UK government taking control of post-Brexit trade deals and not listening to the devolved governments? I know we've said this slightly, but just so that I get this right in my own head, is there a concern that we could end up with a situation where the flexibility is taken away and it's very difficult for us?
Well, whether it's the Scottish Government, the UK Government or an international body, NGOs will always want more transparency and more engagement. And I think both Johnny and I have expressed our concern with the need for trade deals to continue to recognise the environmental, the animal welfare, the employment standards, etc., that apply in the UK and in Scotland. And we will continue to argue that case, whoever is responsible for it. I think that one of the things that trade deal negotiations around the world have demonstrated is that where there is greater openness, transparency, engagement of subnational bodies, engagement of states within a federal system or devolved administrations within a UK-like system, that usually results in greater transparency, greater engagement with stakeholders, greater arguments about issues like environmental standards and animal welfare standards and so on. So, we can see that the way the provinces deal with trade arrangements within Canada is a good example. So, in terms of these trade issues, the greater involvement of all parties and the more open and transparent that it takes place and provides greater opportunity for people to make their case for, in our case, environmental standards to be maintained.
Okay, and one final question, Convener, to Jonathan Hall. I would just like, you mentioned earlier on the idea of post-Brexit trade deals, that the excessive effect of a UK government on our flexibility could cause problems. Just to clear it up again in my own mind, are there any further examples that you could possibly give me of where this would be a problem for us or for you and your industry?
In terms of can I just clarify, in terms of the standards on which imports might come into the UK under a future, well,
I didn't want to mention chlorinated chicken because the Tories go a bit, excitable at that stage.
Ruling out chlorinated chicken and hormone-treated beef, let's just set those aside. But let's just focus on the production standards rather than the actual the food safety standards, if I can put it that way. Clearly, if something is produced to a different environmental and/or animal health and welfare standard in one part of the world, e.g. the US, and under a free trade agreement that was allowed access to the UK market, but it was done, and I referred to this earlier in my comments, but that production was done at a lower cost per unit because of the different standard, then that could pose a threat to British and Scottish producers' interests. And, that's what we've always highlighted to the UK government, and we will continue to highlight to the UK government. Clearly, there's governance around food safety issues because we've got the Food Standards Agency and the Food Standards Scotland, which ensure that the actual safety of food that consumers eat is paramount. But then there's the other argument around actually, well, how was the food produced in the first place in the country of origin? Now, under any free trade agreement, it's very difficult it would be very difficult for the UK to govern and police the standards of production in another part of the world. And we know that, we accept that. However, we have to be very, very mindful that any future trading arrangement whereby production is operated at a significantly different and lower standard in terms of the environment and animal health and welfare could bring a competitive disadvantage to domestic producers. And that's what we've always maintained. Hence the reason why we want standards to be on the front of both the UK Agriculture Bill and the UK Trade Bill.
Okay, thank you, George. We'll now go to Angela Constant, who has a supplementary in this area, I think.
Thank you very much, Convener. Following on from George Adams' questions around the trade bill and trade deals, I note that members of the panel have, and Link in particular, so I suppose my questions primarily for Mr. Austin, have been urging the UK to make a very clear commitment that trade deals will not negatively impact on environmental standards on any of the four home nations. So could I ask Mr Austin, what commitments have you received from the UK government to date?
Verbal commitments in policy aspirations, which are similar to those that are made by the Scottish government. So in case, as we say, that there is no legally binding commitment to maintain environmental standards in the UK Environment Bill. The proposal that the farming unions and the environmental NGOs proposed for the agriculture bill in terms of maintaining environmental standards in trade deals was defeated, although the case will continue to be made for that. But in all cases, governments seem to believe that stating a high environmental ambition as a policy aspiration is a good thing, and we would agree it is a good thing. But the UK government has declined to put any of their aspirations into any form of legally binding commitment in any of the Brexit-related legislation. And to date, I haven't seen any similar commitment by the Scottish government. It remains a policy aspiration and, as I said, a non-statutory environmental strategy. And that is one of the arguments why we think for the Scottish government to be better than the UK government, a statutory underpinning of the environment strategy and linking keeping pace and other powers to the achievement of those ambitions would be a good thing to do.
Okay, and we know that it's your aspiration to have, commonly agreed minimum standards across the UK. That seems very eminent and practical. But if I could press you, how do you think that this is achievable when nothing from the UK suggests that they intend to maintain standards in the way that the Scottish Government has outlined? And if I could use as an example the UK Environmental Bill, which I would put to you as particularly weak and effective with its non-regression clause, which doesn't actually prevent non-regression, whereas all it appears to require is for a UK minister to stand up and say that this legislation will regress standards without any mechanism to address this. Hence the risk is that they'll just plough on. So can I not put it to you that it's the case that this non-regression in the UK legislation is very backward looking, whereas by contrast, Scottish Government's keeping pace powers positive and forward looking and give us the power to maintain and align with regards to Scottish needs and aspirations in the future?
First, I would agree with you about the weakness of the Environment Bill, and it's something that we are certainly have been lobbying to improve. I'm not quite sure I find the description of legislation as forward-looking or backward-looking very useful, because in a sense legislation is legislation as to what it does, and as we've described before, the keeping pace power is just that, it's a power. If this Scottish Government or future Scottish governments during the duration of this legislation choose not to use the power, they can just simply do nothing for the next 10 years, and there's nothing in this bill that requires them to be as aspirational as you suggest they are. They say they are, I agree, but they don't necessarily, and that underlines my argument for linking the power to a purpose, for underlining the commitment to environmental standards, to animal welfare standards, to social protections or whatever, in order to illustrate and demonstrate and make a commitment to not, in your words, non-regression, whether it's the words non-regression are used or dynamic alignment, or I feel it's better to link it to the outcomes that we're after, rather than alignment with a third party, the EU in this case, because there's no sign of it at the moment, but there's nothing in theory to prevent the EU lowering environmental standards. And in that case, I would not want the Scottish Government to keep pace with an EU that goes the wrong way. I would rather the Scottish Government kept to high environmental standards, full stop, if you see what I mean. And so that underlines my feeling that we should do what you suggest and have some form of commitment to a non-regression from existing or better standards, not necessarily tied to anything else. And that's why a linkage to the environment strategy and our own environmental targets would actually underline and put in law the commitment that you're suggesting the Scottish Government has.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Mr. Austin. Can I just quickly ask Mr. Hall if he has received any guarantees in terms of NUF's interest in terms of trade deals?
You broke up slightly there, but I think you were asking if we've received any guarantees from the UK government regarding standards and trade deals. Is that right?
Yeah.
A bit like Lloyd's answer, yes, we've had lots of verbal guarantees, lots of reassurance in that respect, but nothing that you would hold as being a solid commitment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've covered a lot of detailed ground, and that was quite a lengthy session. So can I thank Jonathan and Lloyd for their evidence today. I now suspend for only 2 or 3 minutes to ensure our next panel's witnesses are ready, and I'll put ready in the chat bar when we're ready to go. Thank you. I welcome our second panel of witnesses to the meeting. We have Councillor Stephen Heddle, who is the Environment and Economy spokesman at COSLA, and we've also got Mary Snowdon, who's the coordinator of the Human Rights Consortium in Scotland. I understand, Councillor Heddle, you wish to make a very brief opening statement before we move to questions from the committee. Can I invite you to do so now, please?
Yeah, thank you very much, Convener. I'm Councillor Stephen Heddle, I'm from Orkney, and I'm COSLA's Environment and Economy spokesperson. However, I'm also the lead COSLA representative in the Council of European Municipalities and Regions, where I'm the territorial development spokesperson. And furthermore, I have previous and present experience in various other international roles on behalf of local government, such as the CPMR, where I was a member of its political bureau. Now, COSLA is the national and international voice of the 32 councils. Is very glad to have the opportunity to give evidence to this committee's inquiry, and we've made submissions to the related committees and EU matters. But our key politically agreed position with regard to this bill is that any new EU-derived powers and legislation that the Scottish Government wishes to replicate in Scotland should be the result of proper consultation to Scottish local government, wherever such issues cut across existing local government competence. And the same applies to any discussion on apportionment of EU return powers or the creation of new UK and Scottish enforcement bodies, such as Environment Standards Scotland, which is foreseen in this bill, but also, for example, any new UK state aid regulator. And furthermore, when looking at future EU legislation, our view is that the future Scottish and UK commitments and reporting with the EU and indeed other international bodies should have the ownership of Scottish local government. Positively, both the UK and Scottish governments have formally confirmed to COSLA that they wish to replicate the consultative arrangements on EU legislation that existed during EU membership. And members may recall from the first evidence session of this bill that there's an opportunity to do just that by expanding the bill's section 9(2)(g) provision for consultation with local government, not just for environmental matters, but also for other policy areas intersecting local government powers. Finally, I'd just like to say the aspirations to keep pace for us in local government resonate with the democratic principles of the European Charter of Local Self-Government, the bill of which we hope will achieve unanimous cross-party support.
Thank you very much, Councillor Heddle. Can I now just go straight to Murdo Fraser for the first question, please?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the witnesses. I wonder if I could just put to you both the same question that I put to the first panel around the question of parliamentary scrutiny. We've heard from other witnesses that it might be appropriate to use secondary legislation to minor amendments to existing laws, but where we're looking at introducing entirely new laws and changes of policy, it would not be appropriate to do this by secondary legislation, because that limits the parliamentary scrutiny, the scope for consultation, and does not allow Parliament to amend what's being proposed, as opposed to primary legislation, which does allow parliamentarians the right to amend and has a much higher standard in terms of consultation and scrutiny. So I wonder if you have any views on that issue. Maybe I could start with Mary Snowdon first.
Yeah, good morning. That's a really interesting question, and one that we have grappled with throughout this Brexit process. So us at the consortium, together with many different organisations, were involved in discussions at Westminster when the Withdrawal Act was going through, and obviously those Henry VIII powers were a significant concern. And certainly our experience of the Brexit process has been, in general, a lack of consultation, a lack of opportunities to participate in decision making, and a lessening, a weakening of scrutiny, which is extremely concerning. We've worked in our Brexit project, which is all around making sure civil society has the information and the understanding around the impacts of Brexit on their work. So we have had loads of discussions with organisations across Scotland, but also worked really closely with organisations across the UK, and that has been the experience across the board, is a lack of consultation and that lack of scrutiny being quite concerning. So certainly when it comes to this bill, there may well be a need for definite criteria about when it's used. I can absolutely understand that, but we would absolutely be of the view that these powers are needed, because the EU has been a huge positive force in terms of progressing human rights, and we are absolutely want Scotland to go forwards and not backwards. And so these powers are absolutely needed. In terms of the detail around the scrutiny, I think there's certainly a discussion to be had in terms of making sure that they're only used for appropriate purposes.
Okay, thank you very much. And the same question to Councillor Heddle, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. I mean, on the matter of scrutiny, it would be disingenuous for me to say that it costs less a well-developed position at the level of detail that you post in your question. On the legal form of the bill, our main concern is the ideal outcome. And clearly the bigger keeping pace targets, the ambition that's in the bill, and the ability for local government to help influence that to get the best possible outcomes for our citizens and communities is the main objective. Regarding the kind of the level of detail that you pose a question on there, I don't think we actually have a particularly finely developed position, and it was something that I would need to seek a mandate to explore further. Right.
Okay. Okay, thank you both. I think I'll leave it at that, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, Angela Constance, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. I'll go to Councillor Heddle first, please. Just for the record, Councillor, could you describe what consultation process currently exists for local government regarding EU matters? And can you explain what consultative process you would now like to see with both the Scottish Government and the UK Government? And in this regard, how could the bill before us be improved?
For me, there's a kind of question here whether we're differentiating legislation and EU-specific legislation. I mean, obviously we have the range of consultation that exists to us, but in the terms of the European sphere, we have the input at the way legislation is developed through our roles in the Committee of the Regions, through our ability to influence the European bodies such as the CEMR, such as the CPMR. And also there is the, sorry, I'm just going to move on thread here. There's the no, I need to come back to that point here. It's I'm trying to consider the entire gamut of consultative arrangements that we have. I mean, we have obviously our internal consultative arrangements that sort of cascade in opposite direction through our own COSLA leaders, COSLA convention, and in terms of our engagement with the public, we have the entire range of consultation with citizens and
Councillor Heddle, interrupt,
yeah, sure.
just with you to try and to be a wee bit helpful. In terms of looking to the future, you know, what types of consultative processes do you want in place with both the Scottish Government and the UK Government?
Sorry,
with respect.
Yeah, so I was trying to display the gamut of consultation we have operating in both directions, because I'm very firmly of the belief that the local government has a place in the onion of democracy, that we have a responsibility to the layers below us as well as the layers above us. And in saying so, I've sort of briefly forgot your question. Sorry, could you restate that?
You did give an outline of kind of current consultative processes, with Scotland, for local government as part of our current position in the EU. Bearing in mind we're being ripped out of the EU, what assurances are you looking for on behalf of local government from both the Scottish Government and the UK Government to reassure you that they're going to engage properly with local government? And is there anything in this bill that you think could be improved?
Yeah, sorry, we have specific proposals around that. I mean, in terms of the bill, as previous respondents have said, it's obviously a bill of two halves. There's the environmental side and there's the keeping pace side. And in terms of the environmental side, there are well-prescribed consultative arrangements for local government in terms of the EU continuity bill, and would specifically like to see that applied to the whole gamut of the bill. Now, and as how that actually pans out, that would need to be by arrangement, by discussion between our officers and the Scottish Government officers, and ultimately for the agreement of the Parliament. But for us, the important that would give a statutory underpinning to the consultative arrangements that would prevent a kind of degree of ad hoc discussion that depends on the personalities involved. It would mean there would be a continuity to it, and we feel that it would give a consistency that would lead to better governance over the longer scale.
Okay, and can I just briefly ask, in your submission you spoke of the insufficient consideration given to the evolving UK-wide common frameworks. How will that impact on the frontline work of local government?
It's very difficult to say because, I mean, as you mentioned, we are unsure as to how the common frameworks are going to evolve, and we're going to unsure as to how widespread the application of the common frameworks or the commonly agreed frameworks is going to be. The fact that there is an internal markets bill that seemingly seems to be in a degree of competition with the role of the common frameworks is, it's a degree of concern. Absolutely, the best outcome that we would foresee would be to have commonly agreed frameworks between the UK government, between the Scottish government, and between local government as an integral part of the discussions.
Okay, and Convener, I've got a couple of quick questions for Ms. Snowdon, if you don't mind. Ms. Snowdon, in your submission you said that leaving the EU has already led to a significant loss of rights. I wonder if you could just outline what they are, and whether or not, in your call on the Scottish Government to maintain and progress the very highest of standards, whether there are any limits placed on that as a result of the devolution settlement.
Yeah, we are really disappointed actually that the Brexit process has led to regression on rights already. So from the 1st of January 2021, the Charter of Fundamental Rights will no longer be part of UK law. It was the one part of EU law not brought across into the UK, and that includes some significant protections. It repeats a lot of what's within the European Convention on Human Rights, but is also broader than that. So it includes things around rights around non-discrimination, around data protection, protects things around children. There's many ways, and actually what we also lose is that charter is established, but also the Court of Justice in Europe is continually progressing it and clarifying it and going forwards. So we lose some of that progression, and that's really why these keeping pace powers are really important. We also, I think it's important to acknowledge this comes in the context of a UK government who have been reluctant to commit to the ECHR as part of their trade negotiations. And that for us is deeply concerning, because that should be a basic minimum. That should be a given, and we should be aiming to go further than that. So there has already been regression, and that's really important for the context of this bill, is that we need to make sure we don't regress, we don't become the poor man of Europe when it comes to rights, and that's why it's important to have these this process and duties and keeping pace potential in Scots law. I think there was a second part to your question, which I've forgotten.
Maybe I could just specifically ask you about one of your suggestions in your submission. You want to amend Section 6 of the bill to include a statement that Scottish ministers have due regard to their obligations under the Human Rights Act 1990 and international obligations. Can you say why you think that is necessary, given that Scottish Government officials last week said that it was unnecessary because ministers have to do that anyway, and whether you see any limits on our aspirations as a result of the devolution settlement?
I think it's necessary and valuable to do because we are in the context where the Human Rights Act is increasingly being challenged at UK level, and we need to do absolutely everything to make sure that it's secure in Scots law. It's a basic minimum, and we need to go further, and we are involved and completely support the Scottish Government in terms of what they are doing to look at bringing our international human rights directly into Scots law. That is actually, for the longer term, the most important, significant thing that we can do. But this bill we are talking about is actually a temporary coming out of the EU situation, and that's why we need to make sure that human rights are central to it quite clearly. And I think the other aspects that we were saying, that there needs to be, reflecting also what Lloyd Austin was saying in the last session, that keeping pace is not an abstract thing, but is very much about people's lives and making sure that we don't go below a minimum. And so there should be a purpose to these keeping pace powers, which would bring an added clarity. But there should also be a bigger breadth to us, so that actually if we keep pace only with EU law, we're still missing out on a lot of the benefits that we've had from being within the EU. And so that it should also be broader. And that's why we have suggested around duties to monitor and report, actually, in terms of what's going on in the EU, to make sure not that we take it on sort of blindly without thinking about it, but we make sure we are aware of it, that there's transparency, that we're discussing it, and that we build it in so that we don't lag behind, we don't, as I say, become that poor man of Europe when it comes to rights.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. Can I now go, please, to Dean Lockhart?
Thank you, Convener. My question is for Councillor Heady. Could I ask, in terms of public procurement policy, what implications would there be for the public procurement activities of local authorities in Scotland if we keep pace with all or some of the EU procurement rules?
I think inherent in that question is whether we would maintain the existing restrictions that we already have. I think in addressing that, I'd like to say that I think we think it's right and proper that the UK and EU should maintain a broad alignment on the procurement and state aid rules. We think that will be beneficial to trade. We think it will be beneficial to the operation of our markets. But absolutely, you've highlighted an issue that is perhaps one that local government is majored on, which is the ability for us to have buy local clauses placed in our own procurement rules and aspirations. I think this takes us back to maybe where we had the first session. And I think it was Mr. Hall for the NFU, or actually it was Mr. Austin from Link, was saying that it's a power rather than a duty. I think that absolutely we need to have the ability to diverge where it will make things better. Now, I appreciate that there's tensions inherent in that, but I think there are aspects general block exemption rules that could be explored and developed. The provisions that have been within that show that exceptions are possible. So I don't think we should shy away from the idea that we could make exceptional arrangements that would benefit our communities and yet maintain a broad alignment on procurement and indeed state aid.
Thanks very much. That's very helpful. I wonder if I could pursue that discussion with a bit more detail on specific areas. What particular areas of divergence from existing EU regulations on public procurement would you like to see? If you were given 3 key areas that you could deviate or diverge from existing EU restrictions on public procurement, what would those be?
I would struggle, I'm afraid, to pick 3 key areas. I would just be offering you a personal opinion on that, and I'm very reluctant to do that, given the kind of the broad mandate from a multi-party organisation that I have to carry across. I mean, clearly the issue, the buy local clause, is one that we have highlighted.
Okay, well, that's very useful. Convener, that's all I had. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dean. Tom Arthur, please.
Convener, thank you, Convener, and good morning. I have a question for Ms. Snowden. Bruce, earlier in an earlier exchange said it wants Scotland to go forwards, not backwards. And I think it was in an exchange with my colleague Angela Constance who spoke about how human rights are sometimes perhaps, this is not a debate about abstracts. I wondered if you could potentially just lay out, Ms. Snowden, for perhaps, for constituents of mine and people across Scotland who perhaps are not terribly au fait with the technicalities of human rights, maybe don't have a background in law, what the practical implications are for people in the ordinary daily lived experience of Scotland going backwards, and what are the opportunities for Scotland going forward?
So human rights are eminently practical and about daily life. So some of the protections are around things like fair trial, freedom from torture, those sort of things, which are obviously for most of us are not going to be there every day, but actually a lot of our human rights are extremely practical. So the things about the right to food and the right to adequate housing, there are things about disabled people being able to have an accessible house, there are things about the right to the highest attainable level of health, and that's very much about equal access to healthcare. So human rights, they are absolutely internationally agreed, but they are also extremely relevant to all of us. I think sometimes debates in the past, particularly in the media, have portrayed it as not being about that, but actually it really is. Plus, they are a protection for those who are most vulnerable. So, for example, the Human Rights Act is an extremely important tool to make sure that people who don't have the right immigration paperwork are protected, and that they can't be separated from their children, for example, when there's no reason for that. So they are a protection for our most vulnerable, but they're also protections for all of us in our daily lives.
And I wonder if you could perhaps, you've expressed a concern about the potential for Scotland and the UK to go backwards. Can you perhaps translate that into some potential practical examples of what that could mean?
Yeah, so already, as I was saying before, we've seen, unfortunately, that we are about to go backwards on the 1st of January because we will no longer have these rights that come from the Charter of Fundamental Rights. But also beyond that, in terms of the keeping pace, so that we know, for example, in the EU at the moment, they're looking at around accessibility standards for disabled people. So making sure that really basic things like ATM machines and different services and goods that you get are accessible and reach high accessibility standards. So that's something that's happening in the EU at the moment that we could miss out on. And there are multiple other areas. So as you know, EU has had many directives around sort of social protection, so things in employment, around equality. Some of those things are reserved, but there are elements that are actually come within devolution as well. So there's a lot of elements of what the EU deals with that actually progress the human rights that we have in our daily life. And so that's what's important that we sort of keep up with.
Yeah, you've spoken quite positively and some enthusiasm about human rights with regards to the European Union. How would you compare and contrast that with the attitude and approach of the UK government?
I mean, as I said before, we are extremely concerned about much of the rhetoric from the UK government around the Human Rights Act and also around judicial review at the moment. We are very concerned that they haven't signed up, and it should be a given, as I said, to make the ECHR a basic minimum in their trade negotiations, both with the EU and with other countries. And yet we've seen an apparent reluctance to do so. And so what we find increasingly around human rights, that there is a divergence in the UK where the UK government's stance is quite different, and obviously we are lobbying them to make sure that changes. And what that divergence can be positive in terms of human rights in Scotland. So what we want is not this race to the bottom where we all are equally bad, but actually that there are minimum standards across the UK, and that we are going for that race to the top where there's that progressive realisation of human rights, as in we are always going forwards and strengthening them. And we are very positive, as I said, about the Scottish Government's developments at the moment around bringing more of our international human rights, so those economic and social rights, things like the right to health and right to food and right to housing, directly into Scots law, which is actually the most positive, hopeful response to Brexit that there is. But that is a long-term measure. It's going to take a while to develop. And right now, I think this bill is about this immediate next few years as we come out of the EU and making sure that we don't lag behind, but that we really keep up in terms of human rights for individuals.
My final question is, you use this term which also features in your submission, which positive divergence. Divergence is perhaps sometimes characterised as something negative, but the expression positive divergence interests me. Do you think that this bill is a vehicle for positive diversion on human rights, positive divergence on human rights? Would be beneficial not only to Scotland, but could place Scotland as a progressive beacon within the UK and help to influence policy elsewhere in these isles?
Yeah, I mean, divergence would not be positive if it was going in the other direction, but what we absolutely see in human rights is that if you have shared minimums, then divergence, as long as it means that human rights are more positively protected, can be a good thing. So, as I was saying earlier, we've worked with organisations across the UK and often do around human rights, but particularly around Brexit and human rights. And our reflections continually are we need a race to the top, actually, that actually we can use the divergence of devolution to make sure that we're actually strengthening human rights in different parts of the UK. And not going in the opposite direction. So yes, I think it can be an absolute positive divergence as long as it means that human rights are protected more and not in the opposite direction.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, John. Patrick Harvey, please.
Thank you, Convener. My questions are also for the Human Rights Consortium, and I've got two questions. I'll wrap them up together just to save a bit of time. The protection for human rights in Scotland has been stronger under the devolution framework from the beginning, because the Scottish Parliament isn't able to legislate in a way that conflicts with human rights. Courts can strike down legislation if it does conflict. That's not the case with UK legislation. So courts can give a ruling, a judgment, but it can take years before action is taken. The example of prisoner voting, for example, as soon as the Scottish Parliament had the power to legislate and a bill was before us, it had to be compliant with with the human rights rulings on prisoner voting. What are the implications of that difference if some of the decisions on keeping pace or on regulatory standards are made by the UK jurisdiction under the internal market proposals as opposed to Scotland? And the second question is on the environmental governance side, which isn't so much addressed in your written submission, but environmental governance also raises profound human rights issues. Are there areas of that you'd like to expand on that weren't covered in your written submission around rights issues that need to be strengthened within the proposed environmental governance measures in the second part of the bill?
I might take your second question first, if that's okay. Absolutely, we didn't go into detail on the environmental governance, partly because Scottish Environment Link are a member of the consortium, and I knew they had it covered, and they're the experts in this, so I would agree with all the points they've raised. One additional element is that absolutely the environment and our right to a healthy environment is a basic human right. It impacts our human rights, and it's also human. And so, for example, the developments at the moment, when we're talking about bringing our international human rights into Scots law, to have the right to a healthy environment is a really key part of that, and that will be a really important protection going forward. In terms of that your first question around, so if there is divergence, I think, and the implications of that, so within the sort of internal market of the UK, I guess I would just emphasise that there must be a flexibility in order to respond, and there is, isn't it? I mean, there is divergence already, and particularly around many areas that affect our human rights. Each nation of the UK does things differently, and so it's important that any common frameworks or any across the UK measures really only bring in kind of minimums and allow flexibility above that, because anything else means that we are pulled to the bottom. And actually it's important at this stage, when we're looking at a massive constitutional change, is that we actually build in the framework to have that race to the top, so that each nation can do things differently if it means that human rights are protected and fulfilled and respected more. So I think it's important to go back into that purpose within this bill. But it's also important that we keep that flexibility.
But is it accurate to say that within this mess of Brexit legislation, you've got the internal market proposals, you've got this continuity bill before the Scottish Parliament, in this framework, is it accurate to say that if any decisions about how we resolve tensions or avoid divergence are moved from a Scottish context to a UK context, that also removes them from the remit of the courts if decisions are taken that breach human rights? Is that an accurate assessment?
I would say it is definitely a concern that decisions are taken in London that affect the whole of the UK, and it's a human rights concern, actually. For example, we've just written to the Secretary of State for Scotland recently around their Commission on Rights, Democracy and Constitution that's going to look at the Human Rights Act, and are very concerned around the judicial review because there is divergence on human rights in the UK. It's important that that's recognised in terms of decision making and how things are agreed. So for the sake of human rights, it's important that actually decisions are taken in Scotland, and certainly that they are an equal partner when it comes to making common framework agreements.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we now have John Mason, please.
Thanks, convener. And really, I've just got one area I wanted to ask Ms. Snowden about. I previously asked the Link representative on the question of should ministers be enabled or required to keep pace with EU legislation. So I see that appears also in your evidence that you've given us, that you feel enabling is not enough. Could you give us some comments on that point?
Yeah, similarly to Scottish Environment Link, we think that this bill could be much clearer, and it needs to have a core purpose. So that it shouldn't just be keeping pace in the abstract, but it should be keeping pace in order to protect, respect and fulfil human rights, which is both a UN principle, but actually is across Scottish government policy. It's in the National Performance Framework. It's not new, but it should be the purpose of the keeping pace powers. And we also think that it should be much broader. So it should include duties around monitoring and reporting on what's going on in the EU, because we need to make sure that we don't lag behind. And this is just a bill that will cover the next few years. We need to make sure in this period that we don't lag behind, and that's why it's appropriate that we have those in there. In terms of whether it's a duty to do so, I think the point is that it must be a duty to use these powers in order to protect human rights. That should be a core kind of purpose of the keeping pace powers.
Yeah, I think Mr. Austin from Link did accept that it wasn't simplistic. It couldn't be blanket, that we just absolutely blindly follow everything. But we need to choose. And I mean, you mentioned then, kind of monitoring and reporting. In practice, I mean, is it possible for either the government or the Parliament to kind of keep track of everything that's happening in the EU in this regard?
I absolutely think it is. Yeah, I mean, it was actually a recommendation of a First Minister's Advisory Group on Human Rights some time ago that there must be that monitoring mechanism. It's very practical. It's a way of making sure, as I say, that we don't lag behind. There's ways of doing that. Obviously, it's quite practical. The Fundamental Rights Agency, there's other ways of making sure. But I think what it means that in these next few years that we make sure that things, there is a process in place that is not ad hoc. It's not about decisions behind closed doors. It's not about picking and choosing some bits and not others, but it's about putting in place a process where we make sure we know what are the kind of main rights developments happening in the EU. We consider fully with participation about whether we need to, whether if those were to apply in Scotland, that would advance human rights here, and if it would, then we need to do that, because we don't want to go backwards. We don't want to be that poor man of Europe when it comes to rights. So it's really about in these next years having a process and the commitments and the transparency in order to make sure that we don't go backwards.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, thank you, John. Can I thank our witnesses for that evidence session? It was very helpful, and thank you very much. That concludes the only item on the agenda we have today. I therefore now close this meeting of the Finance and Constitution Committee and wish you all well. Thank you.